Let the crown raise them. I have an empire to rebuild. The sentence was never meant to be heard outside a closed room. It was buried in a sealed affidavit, attributed to a former staff member, time-stamped, notarized, filed. It was the kind of line that does not simply damage reputations. It rearranges history. If the statement was true, then a mother who once claimed she left the monarchy to protect her children had, at some point, considered surrendering them to the very institution she said was unsafe. If it was false, then someone had chosen to weaponize it at the precise moment her world began to fracture. Think about that. The paradox sits at the center of everything that followed. A woman who said she fled for freedom is now accused of stepping back voluntarily. A system long criticized for emotional coldness is suddenly positioned as guardian of stability. How did we get here? The timing is where the file begins to tighten. January 29. A confidential memo circulated within internal channels tied to royal child welfare oversight. It did not accuse. It did not speculate. It documented. The language was restrained, but unmistakably urgent. There were references to irregular communication, missed confirmations, a pattern described as maternal disengagement indicators, no conclusions, just signals. 2 days later, January 31, something more tangible occurred. Archie and Lilibet were withdrawn from their private school in Santa Barbara. The withdrawal was immediate. No transition plan was filed. No transfer documentation was logged, with the UK liaison assigned under the existing custodial framework. No new institution was named. No spring enrolment. No forward academic structure. Silence where paperwork should have been. Within hours, a California-based school administrator flagged the discrepancy internally. Under ordinary circumstances, a parent may remove a child without explanation. Under an active cross-border custodial structure involving royal minors, the rules are different. There are notification obligations. There are welfare checkpoints. Those checkpoints were bypassed. Let that sink in. The file does not accuse her of a crime. It records deviation from structure. And in institutions built on structure, deviation is the first alarm. By the end of that same week, additional anomalies surfaced. Previously scheduled pediatric appointments in California were cancelled. There was no documented rescheduling. Correspondence between legal representatives indicated instructions to restrict communication between royal education liaisons and certain third-party advisors. The tone shifted from cooperative to defensive. Then the financial layer appeared. A £3 million trust, reportedly allocated for UK-based educational stability for the children, was dissolved. The documentation did not characterise it as misused. It simply confirmed it no longer existed in protected form. Dissolution is a technical word. It means the safeguard is gone. The date stamps align tightly, January 29. Memo, January 31. School withdrawal, within days. Medical cancellations, within the same window. Trust dismantled. Why, in the same week? Princess Anne did not react publicly. She did not speak to the press. She did not summon cameras. She requested the file. The red folder was placed on the table at Windsor in the early hours of February 2. It was marked immediate custodial review. Witnesses inside the room would later describe the atmosphere as procedural, not emotional. The Princess Royal is known for restraint. She does not escalate without documentation. The contents were methodical. School removal without notification. Medical oversight gaps. Financial restructuring affecting educational protection. Legal correspondence indicating resistance to shared custodial coordination. No single element, standing alone, constitutes collapse. Together, they form a pattern. Patterns are what institutions respond to. But here is where the paradox returns. In the same cycle of documentation, the affidavit surfaced, the line that would define the narrative. Let the crown raise them. I have an empire to rebuild. The document was sealed. It was not a press leak in the traditional sense. It entered internal circulation first. It was reviewed in the context of the broader pattern. Only later did fragments begin to echo beyond closed doors. Who released it? The file does not say. The timing suggests intention. The language suggests impact was anticipated. If she said it, it signals strategic detachment. If she did not, it signals strategic exposure. Either possibility destabilizes trust. Consider the optics. A mother withdraws her children from school without forward plan. A trust fund tied to structured education dissolves. Medical appointments lapse. An affidavit alleges a willingness to relinquish direct raising authority in favour of rebuilding a personal empire. Even if each component has an explanation, combined they generate a single question. Is this transition or disengagement? Inside Windsor, the silence after the red folder was opened was not about outrage, it was about calculation. Timing is rarely accidental in monarchy. Files do not converge randomly. Patterns do not assemble themselves in a vacuum. Why did the memo appear before the school withdrawal? Why did the financial dissolution occur before public acknowledgement of any custodial renegotiation? Why did the affidavit align with that same week? How did we get here? Princess Anne did not speculate aloud. She asked for verification. Cross-border jurisdiction was reviewed. Custodial precedent was examined. The legal language surrounding royal minors was reopened. This was no longer a private marital breakdown. It was becoming a structural question. If a parent under shared custodial structure removes children without compliance to notification protocols, does the Crown have standing to intervene? If a trust intended for stability dissolves without coordinated replacement, does that trigger oversight? If statements implying voluntary disengagement surface under oath, does that alter risk assessment? Think about that. Institutions move slowly until they do not. The room understood something else as well. The public narrative had long framed the Duchess as escaping rigidity. If internal documentation now suggested withdrawal from stability, the moral framing would invert. That inversion is powerful. It reshapes sympathy. It shifts authority. But none of that had yet reached the outside world. At this stage, it was paper, seals, dates, signatures, and timing. The clustering of events within a single week did more than raise concern. It created urgency. Urgency within monarchy is rare. It signals that contingency planning may no longer be theoretical. Princess Anne closed the file only after confirming the sequence twice. She did not accuse, she did not dramatize, she acknowledged alignment. Then she requested something that had not been requested in decades, a review of dormant custodial safeguards embedded within constitutional precedent. Those safeguards were designed for instability scenarios involving royal minors. They were written in eras shaped by abdication crises and succession shocks. They are not invoked lightly. Their existence is often forgotten precisely because they are meant to remain unused. Why reach for them now? Because timing can convert irregularity into risk. Let that sink in. From the outside, it would later look sudden. Headlines would frame it as retaliation, overreach, or strategy. Inside the file, it was sequence recognition. January 29, January 31, trust dissolution, medical cancellations, affidavit language, communication resistance, each element alone defensible, together destabilizing, and at the center of it, a sentence that should never have existed in writing. Let the crown raise them, I have an empire to rebuild. If that line was hyperbole, it was reckless. If it was literal, it was seismic. If it was fabricated, it was warfare. Princess Anne did not determine which. She determined something else, that the pattern required escalation review. Across the corridor, Prince William was briefed. He did not respond immediately. He asked a single question about procedural thresholds. He wanted to know whether deviation had crossed into custodial vulnerability under precedent. The answer was not yet definitive, but it was approaching it. And so, in the early hours of February, as documentation was compiled and signatures prepared for review, a decision point approached that the monarchy had long hoped would remain theoretical. A clause existed, dormant, untouched for generations. It was not created for scandal. It was created for structural threat. The Crown had sworn it would never need to activate it again. And yet, as the week closed and the file thickened, Prince William requested that it be opened for examination, not invoked, examined. For now, what he would decide next would move the situation from internal alarm to constitutional action. And once that line was crossed, there would be no simple return. The paradox that began with a single sentence was about to collide with a safeguard written in another century. How did we get here? The answer was no longer emotional. It was procedural. And procedure, once set in motion, does not pause for sentiment. The clause had a name that most people had never heard spoken aloud: Edwardian Protocol. It was drafted in the shadow of institutional trauma, refined after the abdication crisis of 1936, and preserved as a constitutional safeguard against instability touching the line of succession. It was not designed for tabloid storms. It was designed for structural rupture. Its underlying premise was simple and severe. No individual, regardless of blood or marriage, stands above the continuity of the Crown. Prince William did not announce its activation. He requested a review. That distinction matters. Inside the Royal Legal Chamber, the language was technical. Threshold analysis, jurisdictional overlap, custodial vulnerability triggers. The conversation was not about betrayal. It was about precedent. How did we get here? The red folder from Princess Anne had already reframed the situation from private disagreement to documented deviation. The affidavit, the school withdrawal, the trust dissolution, the medical irregularities, all clustered within a compressed timeline. Risk assessment no longer belonged solely to family mediation. It entered constitutional territory. The Edwardian Protocol was not a punishment tool. It was a continuity mechanism. Its invocation does not accuse a parent of malice. It asks a narrower question: are the structural interests of the monarchy at risk of destabilization through custodial unpredictability? Think about that. This was not merely about 2 children in California. These were royal minors in the line of succession. Their status carried symbolic weight far beyond geography. If their custodial framework became erratic, the reverberation would extend into constitutional optics. William understood this. He had grown up inside the consequences of institutional hesitation. His request was not impulsive. It was procedural escalation. Appendix 4 of the Royal Succession Stabilisation Act was cited first. It operates as the legal bridge between family law and sovereign continuity. It allows temporary structural guardianship review when documented instability intersects with succession relevance. The Privy Council was convened. No cameras, no public docket, just sealed briefing packets distributed across a long, polished table beneath portraits of predecessors who had navigated crises without microphones. The vote was unanimous. Unanimity does not imply enthusiasm. It implies alignment. Alignment that the pattern presented crossed the threshold of passive observation. Let that sink in. A unanimous vote inside the Privy Council signals that institutional patience has narrowed. Within hours of that alignment, measures move from theoretical to operational. Passport freeze. The international travel rights of Archie and Lilibet were suspended pending dual authorization under Crown oversight. Legally framed as protective stabilisation, it ensured no cross-border relocation could occur without coordinated approval. No dramatic announcement accompanied it. It was an administrative entry into the security registry. Image rights lockdown for 5 years. Under the Windsor Privacy Act of 2023, the commercial use of the children's names, likenesses, and derivative branding was formally restricted. This was not retroactive punishment. It was forward containment, Royal Restoration Fund. £12 million were allocated into a newly structured trust designed explicitly for emotional stabilisation, private education continuity, and reintegration care within UK jurisdiction. Unlike the dissolved £3 million structure referenced in Part 1, this fund was secured under Crown trusteeship. There were no sirens, no confrontation in hallways, no public denunciation. There were signatures. And those signatures did more than restrict movement. They recalibrated power. When the Edwardian Protocol transitions from review to activation, it shifts the gravitational centre of authority. Informal, maternal or paternal discretion becomes secondary to institutional guardianship review, not erased, subordinated. That is a profound distinction. William signed not as a brother-in-law. He signed as heir apparent. Princess Anne endorsed not as an aunt, she endorsed as Princess Royal, custodian of procedural discipline. King Charles approved with full sovereign awareness. The mechanism had now moved beyond analysis. It was active. But here is the question that lingered unspoken in that chamber. Was this solely about protecting children from perceived instability, or was it also about insulating the future of succession from reputational volatility? No one framed it as the latter. Official language remained focused on welfare, emotional consistency, educational continuity, legal clarity. Yet the architecture of the response was unmistakably constitutional. How did we get here? When monarchy acts to protect minors, it protects more than minors. It protects narrative continuity. It protects legitimacy. It protects the perception that the line of succession is insulated from private turbulence. That insulation was now being reinforced, and reinforcement carries cost. Because once the Crown asserts structural guardianship oversight, reconciliation becomes more complex, not impossible, procedurally layered. The passport freeze limited spontaneous relocation. The image rights lockdown limited monetisation leverage. The Royal Restoration Fund centralised financial protection under Crown trustees. Each step narrowed unilateral agency. Each step reduced negotiation flexibility. When institutions move this precisely, they are not improvising. They are executing contingency frameworks drafted long before the current actors entered the stage. Think about that. The Edwardian Protocol was written generations ago. It anticipated scenarios where individual decisions could ripple outward into constitutional fragility. Its authors could not have imagined streaming platforms or global branding, but they understood volatility. Volatility is what institutions neutralize. Inside the chamber, there was no celebration. There was acknowledgement of finality. Once the Privy Council votes unanimously under Appendix 4, reversal requires evidentiary counterweight. Not emotion, not apology, counterweight. William's signature did something else that few outside observers would immediately grasp. It aligned the heir publicly with institutional rigidity that carries personal risk. It opens him to critique of coldness. It positions him not as conciliator, but as guardian. Guardians are rarely liked in the moment, but guardians are remembered when continuity survives. Princess Anne, long regarded as the embodiment of duty over sentiment, had pressed the initial escalation. William operationalised it. Charles sanctioned it. The Privy Council legitimised it. This was no longer a family dispute. It was constitutional stabilisation, and stabilisation tends to feel unforgiving to those on the outside of its perimeter. When the image rights restriction entered effect, contractual reverberations began. Marketing proposals tied to the children's names became legally vulnerable. Third-party sponsors recalculated risk. International licensing conversations paused. None of that was declared publicly, but industry silence speaks. No gunshots, only signatures. Yet those signatures reverberated across oceans. Because they did not simply limit one mother's autonomy, they reasserted a hierarchy. Crown above individual, continuity above narrative. When the institution decides, is there a road back? Technically, yes. Through compliance, evidentiary rehabilitation, renegotiated custodial frameworks. But practically, once trust fractures at constitutional level, restoration requires more than goodwill. It requires demonstration. The Edwardian Protocol does not function on emotional testimony. It functions on documented correction, and that correction had not yet been presented. In the hours following activation, internal memoranda circulated clarifying scope. The measures were described as protective, not punitive, temporary, subject to review, focused on stability, but language does not erase impact. The passport freeze was immediate. The image rights lockdown was binding. The Royal Restoration Fund was centralised. Meghan was not publicly condemned. She was procedurally contained. And Harry? He was not consulted in the activation vote. He was informed. That distinction would matter later. For now, the mechanism had done what it was designed to do. It had drawn a line between individual discretion and institutional authority. The paradox from Part 1 had evolved. A sentence in an affidavit had triggered a review. A review had triggered activation. Activation had triggered containment, all within days. How did we get here? Because institutions do not tolerate ambiguity around succession, and because timing, once recognised as pattern, becomes evidence. But as the chamber adjourned and signatures dried, another layer of documentation surfaced. Financial overlays, not just dissolved trusts, not just stabilisation funds. Extended contractual footprints tied to image positioning, brand sequencing, and projected revenue arcs that intersected uncomfortably with the image rights lockdown. If the initial escalation was about custodial unpredictability, the next layer hinted at something broader. This might not be solely a fight over who raises two children. It might be a confrontation between institutional permanence and monetized identity, and the financial file was thicker than anyone had publicly acknowledged. The war over custody may have been the visible surface. Beneath it, numbers were beginning to tell a different story. By the time the Edwardian Protocol was activated, the legal perimeter had already tightened. Custodial stabilization was no longer theoretical. Travel was restricted. Image rights were sealed. Financial guardianship had shifted under Crown trusteeship. But then the second file began to circulate. It was thicker than the red folder, less emotional, more transactional. Non-disclosure agreements tied to a Dubai-based media financier, preliminary sponsorship mapping linked to a Qatari backer, trademark filings across multiple jurisdictions bearing the children's names in various commercial classes. Early stage production outlines referencing a branded domestic series internally nicknamed Sussex Kitchen, a projected content calendar that aligned developmental milestones with release windows. If accurate, the documentation did not suggest spontaneous media appearances. It suggested sequencing, structured identity rollout. Think about that. A childhood mapped not by seasons or school terms, but by distribution strategy. The language inside the financial projections was clinical. Audience engagement curves, brand integration tiers, emotional relatability metrics, legacy adjacency positioning, referencing Princess Diana's global resonance. If all of it was authentic, then this was no longer a dispute about parental autonomy. It was about narrative ownership. And narrative ownership, when attached to royal minors, carries constitutional sensitivity. How did we get here? In Part 2, the Crown acted on instability signals. In Part 3, it confronted potential monetization architecture. The NDAs did not prove wrongdoing. They demonstrated confidentiality around negotiations. Confidentiality itself is not guilt. But when the subject matter intersects with children under succession relevance, secrecy acquires weight. The Qatari backer reference appeared in preliminary sponsor outreach drafts. It did not confirm final contracts. It indicated exploratory alignment, international capital, evaluating global storytelling assets. Let that sink in. The trademark filings were perhaps the most tangible. Registrations for the children's names under entertainment, apparel, lifestyle branding categories. Defensive filing is common in public life. It prevents unauthorized exploitation. But paired with rollout calendars and sponsor mapping, the pattern invited scrutiny. Calendar entries aligned projected filming windows with specific developmental stages, birthday proximity, school transitions, first public cooking segment featuring minor with parental presence. The tone was aspirational, market-ready. If the Crown had not intervened under the Windsor Privacy Act, those filings may have remained dormant, but timing once again sharpened interpretation. On the very day the Royal Privacy Act was formally activated under the Edwardian Review Framework, industry signals shifted. Netflix negotiations froze, not publicly terminated, paused indefinitely. Spotify's archived podcast metadata quietly removed references to the children that had previously been embedded in descriptive fields. No press release accompanied the adjustment. It was subtle, precise. The metadata changed before the palace issued its formal clarification bulletin. How did that happen? Did Hollywood independently assess risk exposure following the image rights lockdown? Or did private communication precede public documentation, no executive confirmed? No palace spokesperson acknowledged direct outreach. Silence is not proof. But silence synchronized with timing invites inference. Think about that. When multinational platforms adjust positioning within hours of constitutional activation, it signals either rapid internal compliance or prior notice. No one has stated which. The Sussex Foundation's internal marketing drafts referenced phased audience reacquisition strategy. Phase 1, controlled vulnerability narrative. Phase 2, family resilience arc. Phase 3, branded lifestyle integration featuring children as organic continuity elements. Organic continuity elements. In institutional language, children are heirs. In marketing language, they become engagement anchors. That linguistic shift is what triggered Princess Anne's public remark. Children are not products. She did not elaborate. She did not accuse by name. The statement stood alone, austere, delivered during a National Trust Archives visit, away from cameras primed for confrontation. It was framed as principle, not rebuttal. But principle can function as indictment without naming the accused. Soon after, Catherine stepped into view at a children's charity event, not a press conference, a community engagement. Charlotte at her side. The moment unfolded without theatricality. A small journal stitched with the word hope in gold thread. A camera angle caught Charlotte speaking clearly. We are not currency. Was it spontaneous? Was it approved? Inside monarchy, nothing involving minors under scrutiny is entirely unvetted. So ask yourself, was that a child expressing instinct? Or was it a generational declaration? Let that sink in. The optics were devastatingly calm. No shouting, no legal citations, just a child's voice reframing the debate from branding to humanity. The juxtaposition sharpened the narrative divide. On one side, documentation suggesting trademark structures and phased content sequencing. On the other, institutional guardianship invoking privacy and continuity, but ambiguity remains. Trademark filing does not equal exploitation. Sponsorship exploration does not equal commodification. Production calendars can collapse without consequence. Yet timing once again tightens interpretation. Netflix freeze aligned with Royal Privacy Act activation. Spotify metadata shifts preceded public clarification. Image rights lockdown, legally complicated commercial rollout. Did Hollywood retreat independently to avoid entanglement in constitutional turbulence? Or were calls placed from London advising recalibration? No documentation confirms, and that absence is precisely what makes the situation electric. Because when institutions move quietly and corporations respond almost instantly, the mechanism is invisible but powerful. How did we get here? A week earlier, the crisis revolved around school withdrawal and medical irregularities. Now, it encompassed global distribution platforms and international capital. The stakes had expanded beyond custody. They entered identity architecture. If the Sussex brand strategy envisioned a reinvention built partially on familial visibility, then the Edwardian activation disrupted more than visitation rights. It disrupted revenue forecasting. Financial exposure changes leverage. Under the image rights lockdown, any commercial use of the children's likeness required Crown authorization. That authorization was not forthcoming, not during stabilisation review, which meant projected rollouts stalled, projected partnerships reconsidered, projected narrative arcs fragmented. But consider another layer. If Meghan's strategy, assuming the documentation, reflects genuine planning, was to rebuild public positioning through controlled family presentation, then the Crown's intervention reframed that very presentation as risk. What had been envisioned as empowerment now risked being interpreted as commodification. Institution versus individual. The Crown does not compete in branding. It competes in permanence. Brand cycles last quarters. Institutions measure in generations. That difference in time horizon alters every move. Princess Anne's statement was not emotional defense. It was philosophical boundary drawing. Children are not products. Catherine's appearance with Charlotte was not sentimental flourish. It was narrative counterweight. We are not currency. Currency circulates. It is traded. It fluctuates. It appreciates and depreciates. Heirs do not circulate. They anchor. Think about that. The more the financial file expanded, the clearer it became that this was not merely a domestic dispute amplified by media. It was a collision between monetized modern identity and hereditary institutional continuity. And collisions create casualties. As Meghan's perceived leverage narrowed under legal containment, and as sponsor confidence recalibrated, the psychological terrain shifted. Because loss of narrative control can feel like loss of self. Inside California circles, allies reportedly framed the Crown's moves as overreach, as strategic silencing, as institutional bullying. Inside Windsor, documentation framed the same moves as protective containment. Two realities, one escalating tension. And in the middle of that widening fault line stood someone whose name had not appeared in trademark filings. Someone whose signature was not on NDAs. Someone who had not spoken publicly since the initial rupture. Prince Harry. As financial structures tightened and constitutional mechanisms solidified, he began to recognize something unsettling. He was no longer fully aligned with either narrative. Not fully Sussex, because containment measures limited that path. Not fully Windsor, because the Edwardian activation did not restore his prior status. He had become peripheral to both centers of gravity, and that realization would carry its own consequences. But that reckoning had not yet reached the surface. For now, the file continued to grow. NDA references, trademark classes, metadata timestamps, sponsor withdrawal patterns. The debate was no longer confined to who would tuck children into bed. It had become a confrontation over whether childhood itself could be sequenced for distribution. And as Meghan's perceived power contracted under institutional pressure, another figure was beginning to understand that he did not entirely belong to the empire being rebuilt, nor to the institution enforcing containment. He stood between worlds. And that space between worlds is rarely stable. By the time the financial file thickened and sponsor silence began to echo across oceans, another silence settled somewhere quieter. Monte Carlo, not a palace, not California, not Windsor, a neutral geography, temporary, expensive, detached. Prince Harry was there when the formal notice reached him. His request for temporary visitation had been reviewed. It was denied, not on emotional grounds, not framed as punishment, not delivered with accusation, denied on technical grounds. Unresolved residency documentation, income structure, instability, active travel restrictions under custodial stabilisation, pending jurisdictional clarity between UK and US oversight frameworks. In Crown language, these are administrative qualifiers. In personal terms, they are walls. Procedure overrides blood. Let that sink in. The system he once described as rigid and suffocating was now citing compliance deficiencies to restrict his access to his own children. There was no anger in the wording. That was almost worse. The denial letter was structured, paragraphed, referenced under Appendix 4 Review Protocol. It acknowledged his parental status. It affirmed emotional consideration. It concluded that current logistical conditions did not meet stabilisation requirements. No shouting, no confrontation, No negotiation window, just a procedural closure. How did we get here? Years earlier, Harry had stepped away from royal duties in pursuit of autonomy. He framed it as liberation, as protection, as love chosen over hierarchy. Now, in the cold geometry of constitutional review, that same autonomy had become instability on paper, unresolved residency. What had once been marketed as global flexibility now read as jurisdictional ambiguity. Income instability. What had once been positioned as entrepreneurial reinvention now appeared in legal review as unpredictable revenue flow lacking sovereign backing. Travel restrictions. What had once symbolized freedom now intersected with passport freeze measures and required dual authorization under Crown oversight. In isolation, each qualifier is manageable. Combined under Edwardian activation, they compound. Harry was not accused of neglect. He was not labelled unfit. He was categorised as procedurally non-compliant within a stabilisation framework designed for minors under succession relevance. That distinction is devastatingly subtle. He had not lost his children. He had lost leverage. Think about that. In Monte Carlo, reports described him as withdrawn, not publicly collapsing, not dramatic, just quiet. Silence in a hotel suite overlooking a harbour that has seen exiles before, because this was exile of a different kind, not from country, from influence. Inside Windsor, the logic was consistent. If custodial unpredictability triggered constitutional review, then all parental variables were examined under the same lens. Emotional proximity did not exempt logistical scrutiny. Procedure overrides blood. But what does that do to a man who left bloodline duty for love? Harry had once chosen Meghan over monarchy. That narrative defined him globally. It gave him identity outside the palace walls. Now, the palace walls were not pushing him out. They were simply not opening. He was no longer fully Sussex in strategic positioning. The financial structures tightening around the brand limited unilateral moves. Image rights, lockdown, reduced monetization, flexibility. Sponsor recalibration altered projected narratives. At the same time, he was not restored to Windsor. The Edwardian Protocol did not reabsorb him into core authority. It functioned independently of his personal desires. He stood in a corridor between worlds, not entirely Sussex, not entirely Windsor. How did we get here? Because institutions do not operate on romantic arcs. They operate on documentation. Under stabilisation review, personal sacrifice does not offset technical irregularity. Emotional devotion does not override jurisdictional ambiguity. Let that sink in. Harry's request for visitation was structured around a private meeting without Meghan present. That detail circulated quietly. It suggested internal fracture, or at least divergence in strategy. He believed, sources indicated, that direct presence could recalibrate perception, that being physically near his children might soften the procedural stance. But procedure is not softened by presence. It is satisfied by compliance. The Crown's assessment did not question his love. It questioned structural reliability under cross-border oversight. He had left the system in pursuit of freedom. Now the system evaluated that freedom as volatility. That is the cruelty of institutional logic. It does not hate you, it categorizes you. And categorization has consequences. Was the Edwardian Protocol activation meant to exclude him? Officially, no. It was framed as protective of minors, neutral to adult reputations. But here is the question no one asked publicly. When a stabilization mechanism prioritizes continuity above individual agency, does it inevitably sideline those who operate outside continuity structures? Think about that. The line of succession is not merely genetic. It is behavioral. It is symbolic alignment. It is institutional trust. Harry remained in the line by birth, but spiritually, strategically, the activation of Edwardian review signalled that trust flows through compliance, not heritage. And compliance was now measured in residency documentation, income transparency, jurisdictional clarity, not in childhood memories, inside palace corridors. In Monte Carlo, the isolation deepened. He reportedly expressed frustration not at the Crown, but at timing, at how quickly the machinery had moved, at how the financial file had reframed narrative, at how the affidavit sentence had detonated the atmosphere. Let the Crown raise them. If that line was genuine, it fractured something intimate. If it was weaponized, it fractured something strategic. Either way, Harry was left navigating consequences he did not fully script. The media framed him as spiraling. The palace framed him as procedurally incomplete. Neither framing captures the central reality. He was peripheral to the brand strategy, peripheral to the constitutional activation, peripheral to the vote. He was informed after alignment occurred. That detail matters. When the Privy Council voted unanimously under Appendix 4, Harry did not cast a ballot. When image rights were sealed, he did not co-author the restriction. When the Royal Restoration Fund was centralised, he did not define its parameters. He was no longer a decision node. Let that sink in. For a prince born into inevitability, becoming non-essential may be the most destabilising shift of all. How did we get here? Because the institution does not collapse when individuals step away. It recalibrates around absence. Harry had once believed stepping away would force modernisation. Instead, it forced insulation. The Crown insulated succession from volatility. The brand insulated narrative from institutional dependency. And Harry was left between insulation layers. Was the Edwardian Protocol intended to remove him from the spiritual line of succession? Official documents would reject that interpretation. But symbolically, activation signalled something undeniable. Continuity resides where compliance aligns. And compliance, in that moment, did not align with him. As February advanced, internal conversations intensified, legal clarifications expanded, financial recalculations deepened, sponsor retreat solidified, media speculation amplified. But the most consequential movement occurred quietly. On the 3rd of February 2026, 3 signatures were placed on a document finalising primary custodial guardianship under Crown Stabilisation Authority. King Charles, Prince William, Princess Anne. 3 signatures. They did not merely formalise travel restrictions or image rights parameters. They codified structural control over the future environment in which Archie and Lilibet would be raised. This was not just a custody adjustment. It was a power consolidation. And for Harry, it clarified something irreversible. The path back to influence would not be emotional. It would be procedural. The path back would not be secured through interviews or public sympathy. It would be secured through documentation, compliance, and institutional trust restoration. But whether he was prepared to walk that path remained uncertain. Because walking it would require choosing alignment with the institution he once rejected, or alignment with a reinvention strategy now under containment. 3 signatures had settled the immediate question of custodial authority, but they had also redrawn the invisible map of power. And as the ink dried, one truth settled heavily across continents. This was no longer a story about who left whom. It was about who controls the future. And in that recalibrated landscape, Harry stood alone, staring at a system that had just reminded him of something fundamental. Procedure overrides blood. The 3rd of February 2026. The document was placed on a polished desk inside a private chamber where no cameras were permitted and no transcripts would ever be released in full. The language was precise. The margins were measured. The ink, permanent. King Charles signed first, not as a father, not as a grandfather, as sovereign. Prince William signed next, not as a brother, as heir. Princess Anne signed last, not as aunt, as custodian of duty. 3 signatures. That was all it took to convert escalation into permanence. The Windsor Convention clause, revised after Brexit to clarify cross-border authority over royal minors, was formally activated. It granted the Crown primary custodial guardianship under stabilisation review, not symbolic oversight. Operational authority. Operation Dandelion was the internal code name. It sounded gentle, almost fragile, but its execution was surgical. A private jet departed within hours under diplomatic clearance parameters. No press manifest, no visible entourage. Its purpose was not extraction in the dramatic sense. It was documentation, consolidation, jurisdictional alignment, enforcement coordination, primary custodial guardianship. Let that sink in. This was no longer about review. It was no longer about temporary measures pending evaluation. It was a transfer of structural authority into sovereign hands. Not confiscation, not condemnation, control. The public would frame it as victory or overreach, depending on allegiance. Inside institutional language, it was stabilisation achieved. But the speed raised questions. Why did the Foreign Office engage so quickly in bilateral coordination? Why were diplomatic channels already aligned for cross-border child welfare protocol activation? Why did the Windsor Convention clause appear so administratively ready, as if templates had been drafted long before this week? There is no evidence of premeditated targeting, no documentation proving that this exact scenario had been anticipated in detail. But there was readiness, cold, efficient readiness, and readiness implies contingency planning. Think about that. Monarchies do not improvise constitutional tools. They archive them, they refine them, they wait. When the moment arrives, they execute. The Sovereign Guardianship Directive was issued in tandem with the signed Convention Clause. It formalised the perimeter. Passport lockdown until age 16, without Crown-approved escort. Image rights remain sealed under Royal Privacy Act enforcement. Centralisation of trust oversight under designated trustees. Dismantling of previously unsecured financial structures. Reallocation of educational protections under Crown-managed accounts. Catherine, Anne, and Edward were named trustees under the new framework, not figureheads, fiduciaries. Their role was not emotional reassurance. It was financial and structural governance. The old trust, £3 million, dissolved during the destabilisation window, was quietly dismantled from residual holding structures. Its protective gap replaced with the Royal Restoration Fund under sovereign control. And then there was the matter of Diana. A confidential memorandum dating back to 2020, authored under Queen Elizabeth II's direction, was reportedly invoked to reinforce one principle. No emotional legacy claim tied to Princess Diana could be leveraged for commercial negotiation involving minors. That language closed a door permanently. Diaries, memories, interviews, these may belong to individuals. Institutional legacy does not. The door did not slam, it sealed. No shouting, no televised confrontation, no royal proclamation, dripping with indignation. The institution did not win by volume, it won by time. Time invested in drafting dormant clauses, time invested in legal insulation, time invested in separating blood from authority. And when time met opportunity, execution was immediate. How did we get here? A sentence in an affidavit, a school withdrawal without notice, a dissolved trust, a metadata change, a unanimous Privy Council vote, a denied visitation request, 3 signatures. The chain is unbroken, but victory carries cost. Meghan did not disappear. She did not surrender publicly. She lost control of timing. She lost unilateral narrative leverage. She lost operational access to branding pathways involving her children. Did she lose everything? Or did she lose only the one thing institutions guard most fiercely: authority over legacy? Think about that. Control is not the same as identity. Identity can rebuild. Control is structural, and structures are harder to reclaim once ceded. Harry faced a different reckoning. The signatures did not mention his name as adversary. They did not condemn him. They did not erase him from the line of succession. But they clarified something unmistakable. He was not inside the perimeter of decision-making. The institution had moved without him. Procedure overrides blood. That principle, once abstract, was now lived reality. Would he seek compliance, documentation, and structured reintegration? Or would he remain aligned with a strategy now constrained by constitutional containment? He stood at a fork that no public statement could resolve. And the Crown, it had secured its minors. It had insulated succession optics. It had neutralized commercial volatility, intersecting with hereditary continuity. But security breeds scrutiny. Because when readiness appears instantaneous, observers ask how long preparation has been in place. Why was the Foreign Office prepared? Why did diplomatic channels align without friction? Why did legal drafts require so little amendment before activation? There is no proof of long-term orchestration, only precision that feels almost pre-scripted. Let that sink in. In monarchy, the most consequential battles are not fought in public squares. They are resolved in chambers where language is sharper than weapons, and silence carries more force than outrage. The world may debate morality. It may debate fairness. It may debate whether maternal autonomy was undermined or whether institutional duty prevailed. But one fact remains beyond interpretation. As of the 3rd of February 2026, primary custodial guardianship over Archie and Lilibet rests with the Crown under sovereign directive. That is not a headline. It is a structural reality. The monarchy does not celebrate such outcomes. It absorbs them. It files them. It moves forward. The question now is not whether the institution acted. It is what remains unseen. Because constitutional files do not always close when signatures dry, some remain partially sealed. Some contain annexes not yet referenced. Some anticipate appeals, compliance reviews, or further escalation. Meghan may regroup. Harry may choose alignment. Negotiations may evolve under quieter terms. Or this may mark the beginning of a deeper fracture no memorandum can fully mend. So ask yourself, has Meghan truly lost everything or only control? Will Harry return to the architecture that just sidelined him or continue orbiting its edge? And if the Crown moved this far, this fast, with this level of precision, What else has been prepared but not yet deployed? In royal history, scandal burns bright and fades, but documentation endures. And the most dangerous instrument in a monarchy is not a headline. It is a file that has not yet been opened.